The gavel trembled in Judge Sarah Martinez's hand as she stared at the woman standing before her bench. After 37 years, she had never expected to see that face again, the same cold eyes that had tormented her every single day throughout middle school, the same cruel smile that had turned her childhood into a living nightmare. The defendant looked different now, worn down by life, dressed in an orange jumpsuit instead of designer clothes, but Sarah recognized her instantly. This was the girl who had pushed her downstairs, stolen her lunch money, and convinced an entire school that she was worthless. The girl had made herself promise that she would never let anyone make her feel small again. Now, 3 decades later, their roles had reversed entirely. Sarah sat behind the judge's bench in her black robes, holding the power to decide this woman's fate. At the same time, her former tormentor stood as a defendant facing serious charges. The irony was almost too perfect to believe, but what happened next would shock everyone in that courtroom and prove that sometimes the universe has its own sense of justice. Sarah Martinez had worked her entire life to reach this moment, sitting behind the mahogany bench of the Superior Court of Los Angeles, wearing the black robes that represented everything she had fought to achieve. At 45, she was one of the youngest judges appointed to the bench, and certainly one of the few who had clawed their way up from the roughest neighborhoods in East LA. But success hadn't erased the memories. Every morning when she looked in the mirror, she could still see traces of that scared 12-year-old girl who had dreaded going to school. The girl who had eaten lunch alone in the bathroom stalls to avoid the cafeteria. The girl whose mother worked 3 jobs to afford the uniforms for the private Catholic school that was supposed to give her a better future. Lincoln Preparatory Academy had been her ticket out of poverty, but it had also been her personal hell. The scholarship kids like Sarah were outnumbered 50 to 1 by the wealthy students whose parents drove luxury cars and lived in mansions in Beverly Hills. She had arrived each morning on a crowded public bus, carrying her books in a worn backpack. At the same time, her classmates were dropped off in chauffeur-driven vehicles. That's where she first encountered Victoria Blackwood, the queen bee of 7th grade, whose father owned a chain of luxury hotels and whose mother was a former beauty queen. Victoria had everything Sarah dreamed of: designer clothes, perfect blonde hair, and the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about money. But more than that, Victoria had power. The power to make other students laugh, or cry, to include or exclude, to build up or destroy with just a few words. Sarah remembered the exact moment their paths first crossed. It was during lunch on her 3rd day at Lincoln Prep. She had been sitting alone at a corner table, carefully eating the peanut butter sandwich her mother had packed, when Victoria approached with her usual entourage of followers. "Look what we have here," Victoria had announced loudly enough for half the cafeteria to hear. "The charity case thinks she can eat with the real students." The laughter that followed had echoed in Sarah's mind for decades. What started as occasional taunts quickly escalated into systematic torture. Victoria made it her personal mission to remind Sarah daily that she didn't belong. She would accidentally bump into Sarah in the hallways, sending her books flying. She spread rumors that Sarah's clothes came from thrift stores, which was true, but devastating to a 12-year-old desperate to fit in. She convinced other students to exclude Sarah from group projects, leaving her to work alone while watching her classmates form friendships she could never access. The worst incident happened during the spring of 7th grade. Sarah had been excited because her mother had finally saved enough money to buy her a new dress for the school's annual spring formal. It wasn't expensive. They had found it on clearance at a department store. But to Sarah, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever owned. For once, she felt like she might actually fit in. Victoria had other plans. Just before the dance began, she approached Sarah in the bathroom and complimented her dress. Then, with surgical precision, she spilled red punch down the front of it, claiming it was an accident while smiling that cold smile Sarah would never forget. Sarah spent the rest of the evening in the bathroom, crying and trying to wash out the stain, while Victoria danced and laughed with their classmates. That night, Sarah made herself a promise. She would never again allow anyone to make her feel powerless. She would study harder, work longer, and climb higher than anyone thought possible for a girl from her background. She would transform herself into someone who could never be pushed around, never be dismissed, never be made to feel less than anyone else, and she had kept that promise. After Lincoln Prep, She earned a full scholarship to UCLA, where she graduated summa cum laude. Then came law school at Stanford, where she finished in the top 5% of her class. She spent her early career as a prosecutor, fighting for victims who reminded her of her younger self. When she was appointed to the bench 3 years ago, she had finally achieved the ultimate symbol of power and respect in the legal system. Now, as she prepared for another day of court proceedings, Sarah felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with her position. She had learned to compartmentalize her past, to focus on the law rather than her emotions. But nothing could have prepared her for the case that was about to walk through her courtroom doors. The clerk announced the morning's first case, People versus Victoria Blackwood, charged with embezzlement, fraud, and money laundering. Sarah's pen froze in her hand as she heard that name, a name that had haunted her dreams for decades. The courtroom doors opened, and Sarah watched as a woman in handcuffs was led to the defendant's table by a bailiff. At first glance, Sarah almost didn't recognize her. Gone was the perfectly coiffed blonde hair, replaced by dull brown roots and split ends pulled back in a messy ponytail. An ill-fitting orange jumpsuit had replaced the designer clothes. Hunched shoulders and a defeated expression had replaced the confident posture Sarah remembered. But when Victoria looked up at the bench, their eyes met, and Sarah saw a flicker of recognition cross her former tormentor's face. Victoria's mouth opened slightly in shock, then quickly closed as she processed the impossible reality of their reversed positions. The girl she had once terrorized was now sitting in judgment over her fate. Sarah fought to keep her expression neutral as she reviewed the case file. According to the prosecution's allegations, Victoria had been working as the financial manager for a non-profit organization that provided housing assistance to homeless families. Over a period of 3 years, she had systematically stolen over $2 million intended to help the city's most vulnerable residents. The money had been used to fund a lifestyle she could no longer afford after her father's hotel empire had collapsed during the recession. The irony was staggering. Victoria, who had once mocked Sarah for being poor, had resorted to stealing money meant for people experiencing homelessness. The girl who had everything handed to her on a silver platter had thrown it all away through greed and desperation. As the prosecutor outlined the charges, Sarah gained a deeper understanding of Victoria's downfall. After high school, Victoria had married a successful investment banker and seemed destined for a life of continued privilege. But the marriage had ended in a bitter divorce that left her with massive legal bills and a lifestyle she couldn't maintain on her own income. Her father's business had failed, leaving the family bankrupt. Victoria had bounced from job to job, struggling to adapt to a world where her name and connections no longer opened doors automatically. The nonprofit job had been her last chance at stability, and she had destroyed it by giving in to temptation. The prosecution painted a picture of systematic theft, falsified receipts, redirected checks, and elaborate schemes to cover her tracks. But Victoria's desperation had made her sloppy, and eventually an audit had uncovered the missing funds. Sarah listened to the evidence with professional detachment, but inside, her emotions were churning. Part of her felt a sense of poetic justice. The girl who had made her life miserable was finally experiencing consequences for her actions. But another part of her, the part that had become a judge to protect the vulnerable, was disgusted by the nature of Victoria's crimes. Stealing from homeless families was unconscionable, regardless of who had done it. As the morning progressed, Sarah observed Victoria's behavior with keen interest. The arrogance that had defined her teenage years was completely gone. She seemed genuinely remorseful, occasionally wiping tears from her eyes as the prosecutor described the impact of her crimes on the families who had been denied assistance because of her theft. When her own attorney spoke, Victoria kept her head down, unable to meet anyone's eyes. During a recess, Sarah retreated to her chambers, her mind racing. The ethical implications of the situation were complex and multifaceted. Technically, she had no legal obligation to recuse herself. Their childhood conflict had no bearing on the current criminal case. But emotionally, she was struggling to maintain the objectivity that her position demanded. She thought about the scared little girl she had once been, eating lunch alone in bathroom stalls to avoid Victoria's cruelty. She remembered the nights she had cried herself to sleep, wondering what she had done done wrong to deserve such treatment. She recalled how Victoria had systematically eroded her self-confidence, causing her to question her worth as a human being. But she also thought about the oath she had taken when she became a judge, to administer justice fairly and impartially without regard to personal feelings or past grievances. The law was supposed to be blind, and she was its representative in this courtroom. When the court reconvened, Sarah noticed something she hadn't expected. Victoria's mother was sitting in the gallery, looking older and more fragile than Sarah remembered. The woman who had once seemed like royalty at school pickup, dressed in designer clothes and driving a Mercedes, now looked tired and worried. She clutched a worn purse and kept glancing anxiously at her daughter. The sight stirred something unexpected in Sarah: empathy. She realized that Victoria's crimes hadn't just hurt the homeless families who had been denied assistance. They had devastated her own family as well. Her mother was now facing the prospect of watching her daughter go to prison, probably wondering where she had gone wrong as a parent. As the prosecution continued presenting its case, Sarah learned more disturbing details about Victoria's crimes. She had targeted the most vulnerable programs first: emergency assistance for families with children, rental assistance for domestic violence survivors, and transitional housing funds for veterans. Each stolen dollar had a human face attached to it, representing someone who had been turned away from help they desperately needed. The defense attorney painted a different picture, arguing that Victoria was herself a victim of a society that had taught her that wealth was the only measure of worth, of a family system that had never prepared her for financial adversity, of mental health struggles that had gone untreated during her divorce and economic crisis. They presented evidence of depression, anxiety, and what the attorney termed adjustment disorder, following her dramatic change in circumstances. Sarah found herself caught between competing emotions. Her professional training told her to focus solely on the law and the evidence. The prosecution had built a strong case, and the defense's arguments about Victoria's mental state might explain her actions, but didn't excuse them. The law was clear about the consequences for embezzlement and fraud, but her personal history added layers of complexity that no legal training could have prepared her for. She had spent decades building walls around the pain Victoria had caused her, but now those walls were crumbling. Seeing her former tormentor broken and facing imprisonment should have felt like vindication, but instead it felt hollow and sad. During lunch recess, Sarah did something she had never done before. She walked through the courthouse cafeteria instead of eating alone in her chambers. As she moved through the crowds of attorneys, court staff, and defendants' families, she reflected on how far she had traveled from that scared 12-year-old who had hidden in bathroom stalls. She had achieved everything she had dreamed of as a child: respect, success, and most importantly, the power never to be victimized again. But sitting in judgment of Victoria was forcing her to confront a truth she had been avoiding for decades. Her success had been motivated as much by anger and pain as by noble aspirations for justice. The afternoon session brought testimony from some of Victoria's victims, families who had been denied assistance because the funds they needed had been stolen. Sarah listened as a single mother described being evicted with her 3 children because the rental assistance Victoria had stolen would have allowed them to stay in their apartment. She heard from a veteran who had been living in his car while waiting for transitional housing funds that had been diverted to Victoria's personal accounts. Each story hit Sarah like a physical blow. These were the people she had dedicated her career to protecting: the vulnerable, the powerless, the forgotten. Victoria had stolen from them not out of desperation for necessities. Still, to maintain a lifestyle of luxury, she could no longer afford it legitimately. As the day ended and the court was adjourned, Sarah remained in her chambers long after everyone else had gone home. She stared out her window at the city lights, thinking about justice, mercy, and the unexpected ways the past could collide with the present. Tomorrow she would hear closing arguments and then face the most difficult decision of her judicial career. The girl who had once been powerless now held ultimate power over the girl who had once tormented her. But with that power came a responsibility that transcended personal history, the responsibility to ensure that justice was served, not just for Victoria, but for all the victims whose lives had been damaged by her crimes. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual, her mind still wrestling with the weight of what lay ahead. As she put on her robes, she caught her reflection in the mirror of her chambers. For just a moment, she saw that 12-year-old girl again, frightened, alone, and desperate to disappear. But then her judicial training kicked in, and she straightened her shoulders, reminding herself that she was no longer that vulnerable child. The courtroom was packed as closing arguments began. The prosecutor delivered a passionate speech about justice for the victims, emphasizing that Victoria's crimes had directly harmed some of society's most vulnerable members. He painted a picture of calculated greed, arguing that Victoria had known precisely what she was doing when she stole money meant for homeless families and veterans. Your Honor, the prosecutor concluded, the defendant didn't steal bread to feed her family. She stole hope from people who had nothing left but the promise of help from our community. She deserves the maximum sentence allowed by law. Victoria's defense attorney took a different approach, focusing on his client's fall from grace and mental state. He argued that Victoria was suffering from severe depression and anxiety following her divorce and her family's financial collapse. He painted her as someone who had never learned to cope with adversity because she had never faced it before. Your Honor, my client made terrible decisions, but they came from a place of desperation and mental illness, not malice. She has expressed genuine remorse and is committed to making restitution to her victims. Prison won't serve justice, it will only create another broken life. Then came the moment Sarah had been dreading. Victoria was allowed to address the court before sentencing. She stood slowly, her hands shaking as she gripped the podium. For several long seconds, she stared down at her prepared statement, then looked up directly at Sarah. Your Honor, Victoria began, her voice barely above a whisper, I know what I did was unforgivable. I stole money from people who needed it more than I ever have in my entire life. I have no excuse for my actions, and I accept full responsibility. She paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. But I also want to say something that isn't in my prepared statement. I recognize you, Your Honor. I know we went to school together, and I know I was terrible to you. I was a cruel, spoiled child who thought being mean to others made me powerful. I've regretted my behavior every day since I grew old enough to understand what I had done. The courtroom fell utterly silent. Sarah felt her heart pounding as Victoria continued. I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for special treatment because of our past. If anything, I deserve harsher punishment because I should have learned from the pain I caused others when we were children. Instead, I repeated that pattern by hurting innocent families who trusted me to help them. Victoria's voice broke as tears streamed down her face. I spent my teenage years making you feel worthless, and now I've made myself truly worthless. The irony isn't lost on me that the girl I once bullied for being poor is now deciding my fate for stealing from poor people. Maybe this is the universe's way of teaching me what real powerlessness feels like. Sarah sat frozen, her judicial mask threatening to slip as emotions she had buried for decades threatened to surface. The entire courtroom was watching her, waiting for her response, but Victoria wasn't finished. I want you to know that I've followed your career from a distance. When I heard you become a judge, I wasn't surprised. Even when we were kids, you had more integrity in your little finger than I had in my entire body. You deserved every success you've achieved, and I deserved to lose everything I was handed without earning it. The silence stretched on as Victoria returned to her seat. Sarah realized that everyone in the courtroom was waiting for her to respond, to announce her sentencing decision. But her mind was reeling from Victoria's unexpected confession and apology. She thought about the scared little girl who had promised herself she would never be powerless again. She thought about the homeless families who had been denied help because of Victoria's greed. She thought about justice, mercy, and the responsibility that came with the power she now held. This court will take a 30-minute recess, Sarah announced, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her mind. In her chambers, Sarah paced back and forth, her thoughts racing. Victoria's apology had been unexpected, but it didn't change the facts of the case. She had stolen over $2 million from people who desperately needed help. The law was clear about the consequences for such actions, but Sarah also couldn't ignore the complexity of the situation. Victoria's crimes were inexcusable, but her downfall was complete. She had lost her marriage, her family's wealth, her reputation, and now potentially her freedom. The woman who had once wielded social power like a weapon was now broken and facing years in prison. When Sarah returned to the courtroom, the tension was palpable. She looked out at the packed gallery, Victoria's mother clutching her purse, the victim's family seeking justice, the attorneys waiting for her decision, and reporters, ready to document whatever happened next. "The defendant will please rise," Sarah commanded, her voice carrying the authority she had worked decades to earn. Victoria stood, her legs visibly shaking. Her attorney placed a supportive hand on her shoulder. Still, she looked directly at Sarah, no longer trying to hide behind downcast eyes or defensive postures. Sarah began to speak, her words measured and deliberate. "Miss Blackwood, you have pleaded guilty to charges of embezzlement, fraud, and money laundering. The evidence shows that over a 3-year period, you systematically stole over $2 million intended to provide housing assistance to some of our community's most vulnerable residents." She paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the courtroom. "Your crimes didn't just involve money, they involved hope. Every dollar you stole represented a family that couldn't pay rent, a veteran who remained homeless, a domestic violence survivor who couldn't escape her situation. Your actions had real consequences for real people who trusted you to help them in their darkest moments." Victoria's shoulders began to shake as Sarah continued. "The prosecution has asked for the maximum sentence of 15 years in state prison. Your defense has argued for leniency based on your mental state and lack of prior criminal history. Both arguments have merit under the law." The courtroom was so quiet that the sound of the air conditioning seemed loud. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her following words would determine not just Victoria's future, but would also close a chapter of her own life that had been open for over 3 decades. Sarah looked directly at Victoria, seeing not the cruel teenager who had tormented her, but a broken woman who had destroyed her own life and hurt countless innocent people in the process. The moment had arrived to render judgment, and with it, to finally close the circle that had begun 33 years ago in a middle school cafeteria. "Ms. Blackwood," Sarah continued, her voice carrying the weight of both personal history and judicial authority, "while I acknowledge your mental health struggles and your expression of remorse, the law is clear about the consequences of your actions. The victims of your crimes deserve justice, not just your apologies." Victoria closed her eyes, bracing herself for what she knew was coming. "However," Sarah said, causing Victoria's eyes to snap open, "justice isn't just about punishment. It's also about the possibility of redemption and making amends. You have caused immeasurable harm, but you also have the opportunity to spend the rest of your life trying to repair some of that damage." The judge paused, choosing her words carefully. "I hereby sentence you to 8 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 5 years. Additionally, you will make full restitution to the victims in the amount of $2.1 million to be paid through garnishment of any future earnings for the remainder of your natural life." A collective intake of breath swept through the courtroom. The sentence was substantial but not the maximum the prosecution had sought. "Furthermore," Sarah continued, "upon your release, you will serve 5 years of supervised probation, during which you will be required to perform 1,000 hours of community service specifically with organizations serving homeless populations. You will also participate in mandatory financial counseling and mental health treatment." Victoria's legs gave out, and she collapsed into her chair, overwhelmed by the mix of relief and devastation. 8 years was a long time, but it wasn't 15. There was still hope for some future, however uncertain. Sarah wasn't finished. "Ms. Blackwood, I want to be clear about something. This sentence has nothing to do with our personal history. If anything, your past behavior toward others should have taught you the importance of treating vulnerable people with dignity and compassion. Instead, you repeated patterns of victimizing those with less power than yourself." The judge's voice took on a more personal tone, though she maintained her professional composure. 33 years ago, you taught me that some people use their privilege to hurt others simply because they can. Today, you've learned that actions have consequences, even when they come years later. The universe has a way of balancing scales, but not in the way either of us might have expected. Victoria looked up at Sarah through her tears, nodding silently, in understanding. "I hope you use your time in prison to reflect not just on the crimes that brought you here, but on the person you've been throughout your life. Real redemption isn't about receiving forgiveness, it's about becoming worthy of it, even if it never comes." As the bailiff prepared to escort Victoria away, she turned one last time toward the bench. "Your Honor," she said quietly. "Thank you for showing me more mercy than I ever showed you. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn it." After the courtroom cleared, Sarah sat alone at the bench processing what had just occurred. She had faced her childhood tormentor across the span of 3 decades and administered justice tempered with mercy. The scared little girl who had hidden in bathroom stalls was now a respected judge who had the power to determine someone's fate, and she had used that power wisely. The irony wasn't lost on her that Victoria's downfall had come from victimizing the very type of vulnerable people that Sarah had dedicated her career to protecting. Strangely, their paths had been intertwined all along, one rising through determination and principle, the other falling through greed and poor choices. As Sarah removed her robes in her chambers, she realized that something fundamental had shifted inside her. The anger and pain she had carried for so many years felt different now. Not erased, but transformed into something more constructive. She had proven to herself and to Victoria that power derived from justice was far more meaningful than power derived from cruelty. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Saw the news coverage of your sentencing today, Mija. I'm proud of the woman you've become." Sarah smiled, remembering the woman who had worked 3 jobs to give her daughter a chance at a better life. Everything she had achieved was built on that foundation of sacrifice and love. 6 months later, Sarah received a letter from Victoria in prison. In it, Victoria wrote about her work in the prison's literacy program, teaching other inmates to read. She described how she was finally learning to find purpose in helping others rather than using them. She didn't ask for anything or expect a response. She wanted Sarah to know that the lesson had been received. Sarah never wrote back, but she kept the letter. It served as a reminder that justice wasn't just about punishment or revenge. It was about the possibility that even the most broken people could find their way to redemption. Years later, when new judges asked Sarah about the most difficult case she had ever handled, she would always pause before answering. "How do you explain that sometimes the universe presents you with the perfect opportunity to settle old scores, only to teach you that true power comes from rising above them?" The scared little girl who once ate lunch alone in bathroom stalls had grown into a woman who understood that the highest form of justice is the kind that transforms both the victim and the perpetrator. Ultimately, that understanding not only made her a better judge, but also a better human being. The question remains, when life gives us the power to settle old scores, do we choose revenge, or do we choose the more challenging path of justice tempered with mercy? What would you do if faced with someone who had made your childhood a living hell?